The 16th century, Bruegel's epoch, was a crucial century for the West. It marked a break with the past which brought deep changes, even as the century in which we are living is remodeled before our eyes, the very face of the planet. The, quote, century of humanism, unquote, it has been called, and while this does not tell the whole story, it comprises an important chapter. We must clarify, however, what is meant by humanism. In the narrow sense of the term, it signifies a return to the ideals of classical antiquity, which regarded by man in general, abstract man, as the measure of all things. By this definition, the humanist philosophy is opposed to the medieval conception of man as insignificant and unworthy of God's grace. This view, however, is an oversimplification. The Middle Ages had not forgotten antiquity. They held it in high reverence. The statues of Pythagoras and Euclid appear on the portals of the Romanesque and Gothic cathedrals. In the court of Charlemagne, illiterate emperor though he was, Plato, Aristotle, and Boethius were discussed. In the monasteries, the study of Greek letters persisted uninterruptedly. As early as the 13th century in Flanders, William of Moerbeke translated into Latin and put into circulation Greek texts as specialized as Proclus's theological elements, Heron of Alexandria's Catoptrica, and Archimedes' treatise. The heroes of the Iliad were never forgotten. The episodes of their epic story, as related by Homer, served as subjects for many a courtly tapestry. Alexander was the model of the perfect knight. Even more important is the fact that in the Middle Ages, from the 9th century onward, man and nature were conceived as having their being between two poles, the divine and the diabolic. Whereas in the Renaissance, people began, as the Greeks had begun in the 6th century BC, to consider man in and for himself, to hold him up in the face of the gods. Man thus again became the center of the measure of all things. What is more rightly called, quote, humanist, unquote, then, is any attitude of mind focused on human qualities. Humanism is often misjudged as an attitude of calm contemplation. In humanism, there is always a certain militancy. One can be sure that every time man appears in the forefront of human concerns, his emergence is accompanied by violent social struggles. The birth of humanism coincided with the moment when the bourgeoisie, the burger class, began to assume a leading role. 4 centuries of change in the relations of production had brought economic power into its hands. The middle class, now united with its inferiors in a stand against the classes that had always considered themselves superior, thus laying claim to the power in the state. The Netherlands was the first country in Europe in which this struggle was waged victoriously. By the end of the century, in the northern provinces at least, the change was accomplished. In the Union of Utrecht first, and then in the Republic of the United Provinces, the revolution was carried through and power passed into the hands of the bankers of Amsterdam. Even in the southern provinces, where the revolution failed and Spain eventually dominated, the struggle was no less ardent in Bruegel's time. The Netherlands had a long tradition of class struggle. In the 11th century, the middle class had risen in arms against the lords. They succeeded in overthrowing the strong feudal system and imposing a communal democracy. The Dutch and Flemish people had an overwhelming, seemingly congenital passion for independence. This, quote, revolutionary force, unquote, was rationalized by Balzac in The Search for the Absolute as being rooted in, quote, the domestic desire to have plenty of elbow room when they sit down to table, unquote. This brilliant piece of observation was anticipated by Bruegel in his illustrations. His people love to stuff themselves in comfort without feeling menaced. However, the conflicts of the 16th century involved far graver issues. What was at stake was no longer merely a place for one's belfry and supply depots in the shadow of the dungeon of the local count. Now the very existence of the dungeon was unacceptable. The moment had come for the middle class to raise the seigneurial fortress and to erect the palace of its own government on the same ground. In such circumstances, society trembles on its foundations. Everything changes, including the ways of living, thinking, and believing. The upheaval of the 16th century began with the collapse of the feudal economy. The barriers it had erected and the corsets into which it had squeezed itself were splitting in all directions. The economy overstepped the boundaries that had enclosed it for so long. Merchandise moved at an accelerated tempo. The time was gone when the craftsman worked for a reduced market in the immediate vicinity of his home, or in the case of the more fortunate, traveled to a few not too distant fairs. He ceased, in fact, to be his own master. He became the hireling of an employer who invested more and more capital in his enterprise. The goods he produced gained in volume what they lost in quality. A new institution appeared on the scene, which financed, centralized, and distributed this increased production. The bank was born. Originally a simple loan house, it gradually came to organize a denser and more widespread circulation of products by the more rapid circulation of currency. Credit became an important factor in trade, and letters of exchange multiplied. The banker invested in a rising industry with his own capital, and with capital entrusted to him, his influence in politics became increasingly decisive. The election of Charles V as emperor was financed and made possible by Jacob Fugger of Augsburg. The capitalist class, whose power had slowly accumulated during the preceding centuries, now suddenly burst into prominence. In so doing, it brought about two major changes. First, there was a sudden increase in production, accompanied by an insatiable curiosity about new technology, science, and especially geography. New machines were invented as new lands were being discovered. Secondly, economic competition appeared. Man became a wolf to man, but at the same time he became a virtuoso and an independent thinker. This independence manifested itself in the realm of religion as well. Even in matters of faith, each man demanded the right to think individually. This was the era of the great heresies. New churches were founded along with the new trade agencies. The very shape of the earth changed. Merchants needing more raw materials, novel merchandise, and virgin markets looked for shorter, less costly routes. Imagine what it meant to convey silk across the whole Asian continent to the Middle Eastern ports, where it was loaded onto European-bound ships. Quote, "The earth is not flat, it is a sphere, unquote, it was suggested. Quote, "If this is so, a direct sea route to the Indies may perhaps exist. Let us go west, follow the curve of the sphere, and we shall land by a route which is longer, perhaps, but easier and more reliable on the opulent shores of the Orient." Unquote. Columbus dared to undertake the voyage, and on August the 3rd, 1492, stumbled upon the American continent. Other expeditions followed. The Frenchmen Jean and Sebastien Cabot reached Newfoundland and Canada. The Portuguese Bartholomew Dias sighted the Cape of Good Hope and the eastern shores of Africa. His compatriot Vasco da Gama followed his traces. went round the African continent and reached the Indies. The Florentine Amerigo Vespucci repeated the voyages of Columbus and put South America within the reach of European ships. Magellan's vessels, followed by Drake's, also went round the American continent, discovered the Pacific, and circled the globe. This epic of world exploration was not without its dark side. The discoveries were accompanied by the seizure of lands at the cost of frightful massacres. A painting by Jan Mostert in the Frans Hals Museum in Haarlem stigmatizes these killings. The gold of Peru and the silver of Potosi came pouring in whole cargoes. In less than 25 years, the value of metal diminished by half and the cost of living rose threefold. Poverty grew amid prosperity. Man's ingenuity likewise made itself felt in the fields of agriculture and stock raising, which until then had followed an immutable pattern. The invention of the wheeled plowshare made possible a more rapid and deeper plowing. Bruegel had represented such a plowshare, though still a quite primitive one, in the fall of Icarus. Harvests increased, enriching some, driving others to ruin. The use of incubators spread, and the production of poultry subsequently increased. The New World contributed a vast array of products to Europe. Unknown cereals, such as maize, appeared on the market. Exotic delicacies were prepared. From the Aztecs came the revelation of cocoa. Men discovered new delights. They took to smoking, taking snuff, chewing tobacco. Diseases spread with the influx of goods from foreign parts and invaded whole continents. While the old world exported tuberculosis and smallpox to America, the conquerors brought back from the New World strange ills which seemed to attack the very principle of generation, venereal diseases. The digging of coal mines resulted in a prodigious development of the metal forging industry. Henri de Bouvines, nicknamed Met de Blé, pictures some of these coal mines in his paintings. The most remarkable of these is undoubtedly his landscape with mining works, which appears in the inventory of the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. It is an important document for the history of the first mines in modern times. The site is a composite one, as was common at the time. It seems to have been inspired by the forges of the Valley of the Meuse. But the artist has included in it elements that had observed in the course of his peregrinations in the Harz, the Erzgebirge, and Tyrol. The spinning and weaving of silk, until then the exclusive province of the Orient, reached France when Oliver de Serres introduced the cultivation of mulberries. The ancient cloth industry changed its character. Once a craft, it had become a capitalist enterprise. In Flanders, these changes wrought extensive damage. The urban drapery industry, which had brought fame and prosperity to the great cities, suffered ruin. It could not withstand the English competition and the drop in demand for products of quality. The older system was replaced by a new rural industry, which produced great quantities of a cloth that was not as fine but very much cheaper. This rural production was completely different from the kind that the craft workshops had practiced until then. It was a capitalist industry, financed by large entrepreneurs, and operated by so-called free workers, free from the pressure of the guilds, and freely exploited.